Tonight on Life and Times. Some movies make prostitution look glamorous, but in real life, it's not that pretty.
You don't survive. You're so screwed up in the head afterwards, you can't live in regular society, and so you go back there because you can disassociate. You know, you can just turn everything off and you don't have to deal with reality.
And then, she's under 20 and already has a national title under her toque. Meet America's top teen chef. It's all coming up next on tonight's Life and Times.
Life and Times is made possible through the generous support of the L.K. Whittier Foundation, dedicated to improving the quality of life by supporting innovative endeavors in the fields of medicine, health, science, and education. And by a generous grant from Jim and Ann Rothenberg.
It's called the world's oldest profession, but it lures some very young women. In prostitution, the prime age is between 14 and 16. But how do young women get involved in prostitution? And more importantly, how do they escape? Anna Cuevas has a story of one young woman who got involved when her boyfriend became her pimp.
It says March 10th instead of April.
Standing in the middle of her Orange County kitchen, 37-year-old Wendy Barnes is working to put her past behind her. You see, Wendy used to be a prostitute.
I'm putting one foot in front of the other, but I'm stumbling along and I'm trying my hardest not to trip over my own feet.
It started in Seattle when she was only 15. She ran away from home and moved in with her 17-year-old boyfriend, Greg.
It didn't start this, pimp-hoe relationship. And it very rarely does, I don't think, for anybody. I don't know a woman out there that ever entered a relationship going, ooh, there's a pimp, let me go be with him.
At 17, she gave birth to their first child. Broken with a baby, Greg told her they could make some easy cash if she went on a special date he'd arranged.
He says a Chinese man is going to stop and pick you up. He's going to offer you either $25 or $30 to have sex with you. You have sex with him right there in the car and have him drop you off where I'll meet you.
And she did, getting paid $25 to have sex in the bushes.
I knew at that point I was worthless. I knew no matter how hard I ever tried, I wouldn't be human.
The money didn't last long, and Wendy had to do it all over again.
So a week later, we're in the same situation. But at this point, it was easier for him to tell me this is what you need to do. And, well, I need to do a couple more dates because, he needs his car fixed. And, well, if I love him, I would do this for him. And I did.
When did you realize that you were a prostitute?
I don't think I ever realized I was a prostitute as much as I realized I was worthless. I never thought of him as a pimp. He's just doing this to get by. He's doing this so that we could have money, so that we can have a good life someday.
By then, drugs were in the picture, and it wasn't just Wendy. She says eventually they had 8 to 10 girls living with them, some as young as 13, all working as prostitutes.
How much money do you think was coming in?
Different times, different amounts. We would go out and make as much as we could. The more we made, the more of a chance that Greg would treat us nicely.
It's a cycle that continued for 15 years.
But the business wasn't just limited to Seattle. According to Wendy, when things got slow, she and the girls would get into a car and drive to Southern California to try and make some money. Once here, they would not only take to the streets to perform their tricks, but they would also work motels and even apartment complexes.
We would make runs down here to Orange County, to Harbor Boulevard. Stay for anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months. Work as much as we could, make as much money as we could, and then go back up to Seattle.
Did you ever think about leaving?
Oh, yeah.
Once she actually did, moving into a domestic violence center. But with no skills and no emotional support, it only took 6 months before she went back to the only life she knew.
You don't survive. You're so screwed up in the head afterwards, you can't live in regular society. And so you go back there because you can disassociate. You can just turn everything off and you don't have to deal with reality.
Getting out of that life isn't easy, according to author Anne Bissell, a former prostitute herself. She's the author of the book Memoirs of a Sex Industry Survivor.
It's a guilt, it's a shame, it's a feeling of being marked. You know, beyond all the glamour and the glitter, there's the reality of, you know, what you've done. Even if you were forced into it, there's often a lot of issues around it.
She says Hollywood has played a big role in glamorizing prostitution, especially in the movie Pretty Woman starring Julia Roberts.
Hey, Sugar, you looking for a date?
No, I want to find Beverly Hills. Can you give me directions?
Sure. For $5.
It's not Pretty Woman, and that movie alone has caused us so much harm. That movie alone, I can't tell you how many people have probably been trafficked, have gotten into prostitution. Why did she do that movie?
Bissell has been out of prostitution since 1987. 10 years ago, she founded Sex Industry Survivors Anonymous, a 12-step program to help other prostitutes, like 30-year-old Heather, get out.
They wanted to know how long you've been out of the lifestyle.
2 years. 2 years. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Heather worked the streets of Hollywood for almost 15 years.
This guy said he needed to have sex, and I was broke, so I said, okay, I'll do it. I mean, so I ended up having sex with this guy for really less money, but I can't say the price, it's too embarrassing.
How much was it?
$20.
Is there ever the temptation, or do you ever have thoughts about going back, or are you afraid that you might slip and go back?
Oh yeah, every day. Because, I mean, people still try to pick me up. And I'm like, no, I don't do that. Even my old regulars, they're like, Heather, come here. I'm like, no, leave me alone. I don't do that bullshit no more. I don't like it. It's like, I do that, I end up going back to jail, and I don't like jail.
According to Paula Petrata, director of the Commission for the Status of Women, between 8,000 to 9,000 women are arrested every year in Los Angeles for prostitution.
The focus is generally on women and the acts that they commit, and not necessarily looking for people who, in fact, pay for prostitutes and what their responsibility and what their role is in this crime.
In Wendy's case, going to jail is what finally brought an end to her lifestyle. She was charged with compelling prostitution, basically looking the other way while minors were being exploited.
The first couple of months I was in a total daze. I couldn't even figure out what I did wrong. I was like, well, they'll realize the truth. They'll know that Greg's the one that's doing this, and we just all followed his direction. But that doesn't matter. You know, I was 29 years old. I was a grown-up. I should have stood up for what was right, and I didn't.
Once she got out of prison, Wendy found Bissell's group online and began the slow road to recovery.
I hear so many times, wow, thank God you were there. There's nobody else out there doing this.
Wendy's pimp, Greg, gets out of prison next year.
I know that on August 5th, 2007, I have to start running. I want to move to another country, I really do, but I don't have the finances for it. You know, I don't know what to expect from him.
For now, she's living with her mother and younger sister. And even though she's working 2 jobs, she knows just how fragile her life is right now.
I don't fit into that life anymore, but yet I don't fit into this life either, and I don't know where I belong.
I'm Ana Cuevas for Life and Times.
KCET.org is the place to look for the very latest on Life and Times. Just go to KCET.org, scroll down the page, and click on Life and Times.
The history of Southern California can be told in one word: land. Well, make that 2, homes. And for the 125th anniversary of the LA Times, it's taking a special look at, among other things, real estate. Tom Kerwin is an editor with the LA Times. He oversaw a special publication looking back at a century of real estate coverage, everything from land grabs to glass homes. I talked with Tom about our obsession with houses and land.
We've always been obsessed about real estate. We've graded it, we've built on it, we've torn it down, we've rebuilt it and graded it again. In this particular story, we've identified about 30 or so various touchstones in Southern California, ranging from Howard Jarvis's home to the Cascades up in Silmar, to a peak in the San Bernardino Mountains where the grid of Southern California was laid out in 1872. The touchstones are meant to help suggest that each of these places have a very current history as well as a very rich and evocative past.
What was it about Howard Jarvis's house that attracted your attention?
Well, you can't think about property and home ownership in Southern California without thinking about going back to 1978 and thinking about Howard Jarvis and the great Proposition 13 that totally transformed the landscape in Southern California. We visited Howard Jarvis. Of course, he passed away in 1986, but his widow, Estelle Jarvis, is still there. And we just had a chance to walk through and sort of see the back room where Jarvis had his fires burning and would have his cocktails and smoke his cigars and think about what was going to be such a landmark piece of an initiative passed in the state.
Yeah, that's impacting almost everything, even as we speak.
Still is, absolutely.
But there's a certain kind of house that Los Angeles kind of made its own, and that is glass houses. You focus on that, yes?
That's right. What we found was interesting is how the region sort of shaped architecture in one form or another. And with that, we went to our architectural critic, Christopher Hawthorne, and we asked him to identify an element here of architecture that sort of is iconic for Los Angeles. And he came back with a notion of glass houses and these walls of glass that you see in so many of the great modernist masterpieces of contemporary architecture, from the Neutras to the Schindlers, these enormous floor-to-ceiling panes of glass that in so many ways brought the inside outside and the outside inside.
Another thing we're famous for is not just building, but rebuilding in some of the most dangerous areas, right? And you have a whole section called States of Denial.
Absolutely. It's one of the great things about Southern California is that we love this place so much that we just can't get away from it. And in this piece we identified some places, of course Malibu with the fires, Bluebird Canyon down in Laguna for the mudslides and the hillsides that are slipping away. Also we went to Wrightwood where we found a couple that are basically living on top of a fault line, this great San Andreas fault out there. We love this place and we just can't get away from it. We will build and rebuild and continue to come back no matter what sort of peril these homes in this region puts us in.
You can't talk about real estate without talking about booms and busts, but mostly booms here in Southern California.
Booms have defined the region, whether it's the current bubble, or we refer to it now as, or
we're a little more cautious now, we call it bubble.
Precisely, precisely. But back then in the 1880s, we had a real estate boom that would perhaps put the present one to shame. Fueled by the Southern Pacific Railroad that was bringing people out here by the thousands a day. Speculators just went nuts. At first it was a fairly modest and temperate bit of development that was going on, but soon it took off like wildfire. You had advertisements that showed paddle boats going up the San Gabriel River talking about coming into this region and owning a piece of land in Southern California. You could walk out on the street and you'd be hearing the sound of the saw sounds of hammers as people were building and getting ready for this influx of new Angelenos running into the region.
But it was highly marketed.
Highly marketed. The advertisements went around the country. Los Angeles was billed as being a great home for immigrants. And as we still find ourselves as being a great home for immigrants, we find that the history of this region says so much about who we are today. Pat Morrison has written about Pickfair. Pickfair is the great house that Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. built in the 1920s to themselves. And it was a great house for Angelenos at the time to help identify and to think about what was possible in their own lives. Of course, they could never aspire to that sort of wealth and that sort of celebrity, but the great quality about Pickfair was that it was sort of a house for all the people in one manner or another, sort of a Western White House in some odd way. And Pat follows the history of the house all the way up to it being sort of semi-torn down when Pia Zadora and her husband moved in there in the late 1980s and rebuilt it in the 1990s. And Pat talks to the present-day owner of the place as he's living it with his family at this point.
And finally, you take a look at the big sweep, the evolution of real estate, which was made easy in a way when you look back at your own archives. Huh?
Yeah, it's fascinating. We went into the archives of this paper and we were able to discover that our Sunday magazines, as they've evolved over the decades, pretty much chart the development of Southern California. The first issues that came out in the 1920s were devoted largely to farmers and the orchard. You slowly saw in the 30s that orchard became changed and it became suddenly gardens. And then